So it is so good to be here today with the Reverend Canon John Kitagawa, former Canon to the Ordinary of the Diocese of Maryland and Rector of St. Philip's in the Hills here in Arizona, in Tucson. And thank you for sitting down with me today.
My pleasure.
So John, I'm wondering to start if you could give us maybe a few vignettes or stories about your experience of being a Japanese American priest in the Episcopal Church. What has that been like for you?
Well, I think it's been, a two-sided coin. There have been some wonderful things about it, and then there have been some not so wonderful things about it. And none of it has been on the not so wonderful side, horrible, kinds of things. It's been more on the subtle side, such as noticing that very often I was the token Asian. Mm-hmm. And often asked to speak for Asian Americans, which always makes me kind of nervous. I'm always fine about speaking for myself and out of my own experience, mm-hmm. But often people will say, well, how do Japanese Americans feel about that? And I can say, well, I can tell you how I feel about it, and I can tell you how my family feels about it. Mm-hmm. And there are occasions when I can say, well, the Japanese American Caucus has met, and so we've discussed certain issues or so on. 3-4 years into my ministry at St. Philip's. And I got up in the pulpit on the second Sunday of Advent, which was also December 7th. Oh. And I started something along the lines of, you may find it ironic that I am in the pulpit this morning, and just stopped. And there was kind of a moment of silence, and then this kind of ripple of rumbling going through the congregation. And it was an opportunity for me to talk about my family's experience during World War II. My father's experience and as a priest of the church, and his deep commitment to the ministry of reconciliation. And I talked about the possibility that is offered to us through the church and the graces of the church to work towards reconciliation. I think it was that Sunday that people kind of understood that, hey, this guy really is different. He's coming from a different place. He has a different set of experiences, and we need to pay attention to that. In a sense, that was an opening experience for me to share, mm-hmm. But also for them to receive. And I think it helped to deepen the relationship. I can also say that I have at other times, for example, in the Diocese of Maryland, I was the guest preacher at a church on a similar Sunday, second Sunday of Advent, December 7th. And after the service, I noticed that there was this older gentleman hanging back. And he was the last one to come out to greet me in the usual line there. And he said, I'm General so-and-so. I was a young Army officer during World War II. And I lost a lot of men. And what you said today makes me rethink a lot of thoughts. Because when I saw you get up in the pulpit, I saw the enemy. But you presented the gospel. So that wasn't in Arizona, but
but it's a
but that's a reality
of both the suffering and the healing, kind of at the same place. So John, I was involved with St. Mary's Mariposa in LA for a while, and I think on one of my first tours of the church saw the Snoopy window, where there is a window, a stained glass window in the church that has Snoopy at the bottom. And this is the historic Japanese American congregation of the Diocese of Los Angeles. And Snoopy is at the bottom because he was beloved by the congregation. And then the rest of the window are all the diocesan shields of the diocese that contained internment camps linked by barbed wire. So if you walked by it just without knowing, you would walk by and just kind of go, oh, what an odd little window. But when you know the story, you realize that because this is a congregation that, went off to the camps together, its presence there is an indictment of every one of those dioceses. And Arizona is one of those dioceses.
Indeed.
And when I became the Bishop of Arizona, I reached out to those people so I could get a picture of the window and the story of the window, so I could kind of remind myself of Arizona's participation in that. You mentioned your family, you're a second generation Episcopal priest. Would you care to share any of your family's history of World War II and what happened to them?
Actually, I'm a third generation Episcopal priest.
Oh, I didn't know.
Yes, my father's father, my father, one of my father's brothers, my mother's brother, and a cousin, all ordained. My mother was from California, and my dad was from the Seattle area. Our dad started his ministry only about a year and a half before he was incarcerated. And I go through my own history and think, okay, a year and a half after ordination, I get thrown into a concentration camp. Whoa, how do you handle that?
What does it do to your faith?
Well, in his case, he got very creative. I have a lot of documents, and one of them is a plan for an ecumenical Christian presence rather than just, denomination by denomination. I think his brain just got going. It's sort of like you do what you have to do in the circumstances that you're given. But I get that part. The part I don't get is, where do you get the internal strength and fortitude and all that, and not take doubt your faith. You were earlier asking about some good things, and I think especially in terms of family, our understanding of family is not mom and dad and kids. It's a very wide kind of network, and even some of the most the thinnest blood relationship, and I believe in Japanese, I'm not sure about this, but you can say cousin, and it could be first
all
second,
cousins.
All that kind of, we don't make that kind of distinction, so in the camps, they were set up administratively. So, my grandparents and my mother lived in one unit. My uncle, my mother's brother, who was of age, majority, was single male. So they put him in a dormitory with other single males. And other members of the wider family. My mother was a Sugimoto. A lot of her family were in the country were Teradas, and they weren't even in the same camp. So there was that kind of separation, and there was also, in current times we talk about issues of child separation. And so I think there was some loss of the fabric. And then the other thing that happened was, as the war was coming to the end, and people were leaving the camps, they did not necessarily go back to the communities they came from. So my mother's family did not go back to San Francisco. They went to Chicago and started a new life there. Now, they very much got involved in a Japanese American community there because there were other people from other camps. And I would say that for most families, there was never a discussion about what went on. Mm-hmm. It was just, there was silence. Mm-hmm. So in our case, the euphemistically called camps were pretty traumatic in all sorts of different ways.
So how did you learn about it as somebody who was born after?
Well, as it happens, my dad wrote a book called Ise and Nise, The Internment Years. And I can remember, I think it was at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., there was an exhibit, I was an adult by then, about the camps, the More Perfect Union or something, and there was a model of one of the units where people lived. And Mom looked at it and said, "It's much too clean." It's so sanitary, mm-hmm. you know, because Tule Lake, where she was an ancient lake bed. It hadn't been a lake for millions of years or thousands of years. And there was constant dust and wind blowing and things like that. So I've been to several exhibits since then, and Kathy will attest that I said, "Well, Mom would think this is much too sanitary." So about 5 years ago, I was invited back to St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And I was asked to preach on the anniversary, 75th anniversary, of the Sunday in which my dad gave the keys to the church to the bishop, because they were all being sent to camp. Mm-hmm. So that was a huge, wonderful honor. Mm-hmm. And I guess I did okay, because just a couple months ago they invited me back for the 80th anniversary. So
in the Diocese of Arizona, obviously we don't have a Japanese language congregation. Could you say a little about what it means for a community to have a congregation where they share a common language and culture?
So I for me, this is kind of a controversial mm-hmm. topic. I think there is a really good reason and a strong reason for having ethnic congregations, especially in the first couple of generations of being immigrants. Mm-hmm. After that, and this is based on the experience of Japanese Americans, we became so, I don't know, enculturated, I guess would be the mm-hmm. word. At one point, I was called to be the rector of Christ Church in San Francisco, mm-hmm. which was a Japanese American congregation. And this was coming right out of seminary. And I went for the interview, and it was the most comfortable interview I've ever had in my life. Mm-hmm. All the smells were right. I mean, there was a woman who had gone to grammar school with my grandmother in Japan. My mother is a San Franciscan, although she wasn't Episcopalian at the time. And I thought, this wouldn't work. Mm-hmm. Honestly, the only reason they wanted to call me was mm-hmm. because I fit. Mm-hmm. And I also thought, well, that's not a call.
Do you feel like you've experienced kind of the inverse of that as well? So the one place where they're wanting you to call you because you are Japanese American to a Japanese American congregation. Have you experienced to some extent the inverse of that, do you think, where you're sort of like, because you're the model minority and you're Asian, it's like, oh, well, we can have racial diversity that is less threatening than maybe if you were a different ethnicity because you're Japanese?
Yeah, for sure. And the model minority thing is a real curse.
What would you see as some concrete steps towards getting us collectively unstuck so that we can move into reconciliation and healing?
Well, I think what I referred to earlier is truth-telling, storytelling, and actually listening to them. Mm-hmm. I think that is a really important first step. Mm-hmm. And then finding ways to experience the diverse ways in which we worship and understand our relationship with God. And and especially when we talk about faith, which you can't just say, okay, this is it, cut and dry, package it, and buy it, and, go with it. That if we can understand how different people have received the faith, integrated it into their lives, and then give it expression in terms of ministry and worship, I think those are really important steps, because part of it is saying you count, you're real, you're not an afterthought,
you're not a token.
You're not a token. And so I think if the church can figure out ways to communicate the message that we actually believe, that we all count, that we are all children of God, I think that's very powerful. In a sense, going back to the very basics of who we are. To me, I think that will carry us a long way. In the report we talked about, now we see darkly or dimly, then we shall see
face to face.
Face to face. It's not an overnight project. It's a long-term project. And it's hard to now see what that's all going to look like. But along the way, we need to have a reckoning with our history. And that'll be a big step in the healing process, which will be a big step towards reconciliation.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share stories and talk today.
Well, I appreciate being asked, and I don't. There have been very few times that I've had this kind of conversation, so honestly and openly, and I really appreciate that opportunity.
Thank you. It's a gift that you're giving to the people of our diocese, so thank you.